Terminator, from the Latin terminer, to end. The line of demarcation that separates the illuminated, bright part of a celestial body from the unilluminated, dark part. The history of the last 2,000 years is well known to us. Everything in it is very pragmatic, orderly, and correct. Everything is laid out neatly and systematically. No all-powerful gods, well, except perhaps for the resurrection of Jesus. And even that is in question. Some believe all this is fabricated. There are no centaurs, cyclops, or dragons in our world, but there is plenty of blood, poverty, pain, and suffering. And wars, endless wars with ever larger and larger armies. Wars for territory, for resources, for influence, for someone's faith, and of course, for money. A lot of money, wars, 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 an endless cycle of bloodshed. But all of them can be explained by rational and pragmatic, purely human reasons. More precisely, we believe that they can be. After all, gods do not exist. In our world, there is everything, but there are no more gods. Although at the beginning of human history, gods were literally everywhere. Hundreds of deities, sometimes even thousands. They are present in the epics of all the peoples of the planet. All of world history begins with gods and their relationships with each other and with people. Without them, history simply disappears. If you remove the gods from ancient and earlier history, it turns out that we actually know nothing about that period at all. But at some point, they all suddenly disappeared. They vanished as if they never existed. So at what moment did this happen? Where is that Terminator line, that starting point, which forever divided the history of gods and humans? You are on the channel Age of Disbelief with Mikhail Kalmykov. And now we will try to look at the history of humanity from exactly this point of view. It would seem, what does the Trojan War have to do with our modern harsh reality, where there is no place for gods? Nevertheless, it does. Look, in the previous film, I told you that actually it does. This war started not at all because of Paris's love for Helen, and not even because of King Agamemnon's ambitions, who was looking for a reason to attack Troy. No, actually, it was a planned scheme. A gigantic chess game between the gods, which had been prepared for decades, and even Heracles was involved in it. On one side of the chessboard was Zeus in his desire to prepare a dynasty of human rulers, Heracles, his son, and an army of Trojan Heracles. During his labors, he not only covered himself with glory, but also gained possession of other cities and kingdoms, such as Troy or Thessaly. That is, he united other kingdoms under his rule in order to become, as Zeus had foretold him, the King of Kings. On the other hand, a similar scheme was being prepared. Another king, Agamemnon, who was gathering Greek cities and kingdoms under his wing, and the mighty Achilles, who perhaps was also destined to become a king. The same scheme, one against one, also a king of kings, and also claims to Troy. An insurance in case no one can win. Aeneas is also a son of a god, like Achilles and Heracles. More precisely of the goddess Venus or Aphrodite. That's first of all. And second, although Troy is considered a mythical city where a mythical battle took place involving mythical gods, nevertheless, considerable effort and money have been invested to prove its reality and existence, including by official historians, and in the end, by fair means or foul. Its existence was proven by Henrikh Schliemann, and moreover, it was supposedly discovered by Schliemann. Schliemann was literally obsessed with the search for Troy and with proving the fact of its existence. It feels like this was the whole meaning of his life. So maniacal was his desire. Judge for yourself. This character was born in 1822, which means that a little more than 8 years had passed since the Napoleonic Wars. The famous years without a summer, known for their cold and hunger, had just ended, and Europe was slowly beginning to recover. And so in the family of a poor rural pastor, as we are told, a boy is born. At the age of 11, he goes to study at a gymnasium, but after only 3 years, he gives up this hopeless endeavor and at 14 begins to educate himself. You can imagine a 14-year-old teenager who has studied only 3 grades, the son of a poor rural pastor who nevertheless spent the next 5 years devoted entirely to self-education. Apparently, the pastor wasn't that poor if his son was able to spend the next 5 years studying on his own. And then suddenly, already at the age of 19, he went to work for the Amsterdam trading company Henrikh & Co. 3 years later, he moved to another trading company, Schroeder & Co. And 2 years later, he became not just an employee, but a full partner of the company and its representative in St. Petersburg. At the age of 24, a poor, uneducated young man working as an employee in a trading company managed to amass a fortune comparable to the capital of the company itself. So much so that he became not just an ordinary employee, but a partner, an independent associate who during this time also managed to learn the Russian language. Of course, we've all seen with our own eyes how some talented young men become directors of large holdings even at the age of 22. And quite attractive girls at the same age of 20 or even at 18 become deputies to our ministers. But what about ours? Sometimes former gynecologists become ministers of defense in Germany. Of course, this speaks to their genius. So our young Schliemann must have been a genius as well. At the age of 25, he had already become a Russian citizen. A very, very clever young man. In just 10 years, he actually became a millionaire. He made a fortune during the gold rush in the United States and the Crimean War in Russia. Truly, for some, war is a tragedy, but for others, it's a mother of opportunity. During this time, he managed to learn as many as 15 languages. And after that, in 1858, he set off on a great journey around the world. He visited the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. By the way, my attentive viewer might have noticed that during this period, not only Henrikh Schliemann set off on these strange journeys around the world. Another hero from my previous films is Alexander Lickyer. In exactly the same way, from 1856 to 1859, he suddenly leaves his settled life and embarks on just as crazy a journey around the world. As if someone was driving both of them to certain points, places on our globe. I talked about this in more detail in the film The Secret of Lockyer Castle. But if Alexander Lickyer eventually did return to Russia, Schliemann did not. He became a United States citizen in 1869. For him, Russia had already served its purpose. The millions were made. It was time to move on to the main goal of his life. And so, after attending 2 semesters of lectures at the University of Paris, he became interested in the historical authenticity of the Iliad and went to Turkey, to the town of Çanakkale and its surroundings, with the goal of finding Troy itself. Pay attention to 2 things. First, he never doubted for a second that Troy was located exactly there. Although Homer's description of the area does not match at all with what this town actually looks like. And the second point can be understood if you look at our modern domestic bloggers who have moved to live permanently in Turkey. For example, the channel Forgotten Ruins or the channel Proto-Civilization. Judging by what they show, Turkey is one huge nursery of ancient ruins, and ancient structures stick out from under the ground there like mushrooms, literally at every step. Take anyone, call it any mythical name, and start digging. No one will check. Actually, Schliemann did exactly that. In 1870, he received permission from the government of the Ottoman Empire to conduct archaeological excavations. And as expected, he immediately found some ruins, which he called Troy. At first, he didn't have enough experience, and his team accidentally destroyed the layer of the very Homeric Troy and began excavating earlier layers, mistaking them for the right trace. And then Schliemann fabricated the discovery of the treasure, calling it Priam's treasure. Well, how else? Well, every self-respecting Trojan king simply had to have a treasure hoard that he hurriedly gathered and buried at night while Troy was being destroyed by the Achaeans, right? Indeed, nothing was more crucial to him right then. Other archaeologists noticed this right away, but money is money. If a millionaire is ready to donate kilograms of gold just to prove he's right, then who can stop him? Yes, what's gold compared to that? Schliemann even named 2 of his children from his second marriage after characters from the Trojan War. He named his daughter Andromache after the daughter of the Trojan prince Hector, and his son, no less, Agamemnon, after the Achaean king of all kings who led the war against Troy. Moreover, after his son was born, Schliemann took the baby up to the roof, performed a ritual dedicating him to the sun, and then touched the baby's head with a volume of Homer. Like an oath, but not on the Bible, on the Iliad. His son had quite a fun childhood, no doubt about it. By the way, when little Agamemnon Schliemann grew up, he became a politician and eventually served as a member of the Greek parliament. Just appreciate the idea's beauty. A United States citizen was a member of the Greek parliament and later became the Greek ambassador to the United States. It's a mind-blowing twist in its perversity. But let's get back to Henrikh Schliemann. So, here's the picture. The place of Troy found by Schliemann doesn't match Homer's description at all. There are no 2 wide rivers surrounding a flat plain rising above the sea. This place is quite far from the shore, about 4.5 to 6 kilometers from the seacoast. What kind of control over cargo in the port can there be? Secondly, the place was clearly chosen at random and hastily. Thirdly, the ruins and remains of Homeric Troy were very conveniently destroyed by unprofessional workers. Supposedly, at that time, they didn't have any archaeological skills yet, and out of ignorance, they simply destroyed the entire layer that pertained specifically to the Trojan War. He was honest, really honest, but we accidentally erased him. But there is a magnificent bribe in the form of a king's treasure of gold. And now the entire scientific world is passionately arguing that Troy was located right there, in Turkey, not far from the city of Çanakkale. But what about Taganrog? And Taganrog has these 2 large rivers surrounding the region of Troy on both sides. There is also a plain rising several meters above the sea, which conveniently helps with defense. By the way, that area is literally soaked with the blood of failed landing parties over the past 300 years. It was attempted to be taken by Red Army soldiers during the Revolution, by White Guards, by the English and the French during the Crimean War, and by many others. The fascists carried out mass executions of the population there. And this strongly resembles a sacrificial ritual, since it was carried out just a couple of 100 meters from that very stone pipe of the mysterious ancient tunnel that I talked about in previous films. This place is simply impossible to take from the sea. The shoreline itself is an impregnable fortress. I've already talked about this as well, so now I'll add a couple of new, let's say not facts, but reasons to think about. For example, the Amazons. As is known, the Amazons under the leadership of Queen Penthesilea were allies of Troy. And they intervened in the war, striking the Achaeans from the rear and inflicting heavy losses. Queen Penthesilea herself was later killed by Achilles. What could possibly be strange about that? Everyone knows that the Amazons lived on the territory of modern-day Turkey, either on the southern coast of the Black Sea or on the northern coast of the Mediterranean, in Lycia. But at the same time, their queen, Penthesilea, was originally from Thrace, which is present-day Bulgaria. How did she end up traveling from Bulgaria to Lycia? And how did she become the queen of the Amazons? The story says that she accidentally killed another Amazon queen, her own sister Hippolyta, while hunting, and that's how she became the next leader. According to another version, Hippolyta was killed by Heracles, but since Hippolyta was her sister, that means she also came here from Thrace. So that still doesn't answer the question. Let's try to figure it out. Amazons. First of all, the name Hippolyta in translation means mistress of horses, someone who harnesses horses. That is, something like a stable master or maybe a horsewoman. In other words, simply a woman who owns a horse. This means having a personal horse, or maybe even many horses. That was important. Secondly, she is the sister of Penthesilea, which means they were both from Thrace, that is, in modern-day Bulgaria. Thirdly, Amazons are known precisely for being tireless riders and fought specifically on horseback. This is important as well. Fourthly, judging by indirect evidence, their kingdom was located somewhere very close to Troy. Since they continuously observed the war and did not intervene until Achilles killed Hector. Fifthly, since the Amazons were tireless horsewomen who fought on horseback, they had no infantry warriors, only mounted fighters, only with bows and spears. It is mentioned that they spent almost their entire lives in the saddle. Doesn't that remind you of anyone? Besides, Troy itself is associated with horses. In any case, not just with the Trojan horse. Long before the well-known events, Zeus made sure that 2 winged horses of the gods were prepared for Heracles, specifically in Troy. And since horses are an essential attribute of any Amazon, let's get to know the horses a little better as well. A horse is a domesticated single-hoofed mammal. People began to domesticate horses about 6,000 years ago, and it is believed that their domestication was widespread by 3,000 years before our era. They have proven themselves in the best way both as a means of movement, as transport, and as a draft force for agricultural work. Thanks to their strength, endurance, and speed, they have occupied the maximum possible number of niches useful to humans. In symbiosis with humans, when a person takes on the responsibility for their nutrition, health, and protection, horses can accompany him everywhere, on the plains and in the mountains, in the desert or in the forest, in the heat and in the bitter cold. However, all this is only possible under the careful control and care of a human. Because despite their endurance and strength, horses are very fragile and skittish animals. In nature, their survival is guaranteed by running and only by running. And that means they need large open plains like steppes, plenty of fresh water, and a lot of food that provides energy for running. In a day, one horse eats about 10 to 11 kilograms of feed and drinks around 40 liters of water. So, a small group of about 50 horses eats half a ton of feed and drinks 2 tons of water every day. That's what we'll base our calculations on. Could the army of Amazons have attacked the Greeks if Troy was located in Turkey? To answer that, we need to understand the size of this unit. Ancient historians don't give specific numbers, only the names of the leaders of the Amazon detachments. But we know that the Amazons were always near Troy and observed the war without interfering. That means there were vast pastures nearby, plenty of water, and flat open spaces for possible mounted attacks, for gaining speed, for attacking, for maneuvering, for retreating, and so on. Next, we know the numbers of the Greek and Trojan armies. The Greeks had about 50,000 soldiers, and the Trojans had a little fewer, but a comparable amount. Let's assume that over the years of war, the number of soldiers in both armies was reduced by half. So, at the time of the Amazons' attack, the Greeks had about 25 to 30,000 soldiers, and they were already winning. So, it makes no sense to attack them unless you're sure that your intervention can provide, if not decisive help, then at least definitely influence the balance of power. If the Greeks' attackers, the horsewomen, had been armored like knights or cataphracts, then even half a hundred would have been enough to make a noticeable impact. But the Amazons were not armored, and they didn't attack from a distance with bows, keeping the enemy at bay as we're used to. They fought in close combat. This is mentioned in references to the now-lost epic Aethiopus by Arctinus of Miletus, which tells about the events that took place right after Hector was killed by Achilles. It is mentioned that the Amazon horsewomen cut through the ranks of the Greeks like a knife through butter. One way or another, the Amazons joined the Trojan army. That was a very significant help, and after that, the scales began to tip in favor of the Trojans again. Once again, personal intervention from Achilles was required. From this, we should conclude that the army of Amazons numbered at least 1,000 horsewomen, and most likely even more. What am I getting at? The point is that such an army of horses would have to eat at least 6 tons of hay and drink 20 tons of clean water per day. Where would you get all that in a besieged city? And let's not forget that the Amazons observed the war for many years without getting involved. But the horses had to eat something, they had to drink something. And if the Amazons didn't have any foot soldiers, and they didn't, then this means that for the emergence of such an army, the presence of vast and flat territories, the steppe, is necessary. That's where such armies arise. And history confirms this. The mounted hordes of the Tatar Mongols, the Cossacks, the cavalry ranks, and other nomadic tribes. There are no such territories in Turkey. The terrain there is mostly mountainous and hilly. Yes, of course, there are also flat areas, but there aren't enough of them. For the emergence of a purely cavalry army without infantry soldiers, you need not just fields, but flat territories stretching for many, many days of horseback travel in all directions. But in the Azov region, the northern Black Sea area, and further north, all the way up to Voronezh, there are plenty of such lands. And even in long-suffering Thrace, which is supposedly the homeland of the Amazon queens, there are such fields in the northern part. And it is precisely in these territories that you find mounted hordes of all kinds and colors, from nomads to Cossacks. And here is where things get really interesting. The thing is, the data from mythology and archaeology don't match up. The Amazons were known long before the Trojan War. Even the Argonauts visited them during their quest for the Golden Fleece. One of the episodes of Heracles' adventures is also connected with them. The Amazons are mentioned in one way or another by Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, and Aeschylus. But it is very difficult to find their real homeland and places of residence based on the myths. Aeschylus also says that they lived around Lake Maeotis and near Colchis. That is, right by the Azov steppes in the foothills of the Caucasus. However, Strabo and many other ancient historians place their capital in the city of Themyscira, near the Thermodon River, which is on the southern coast of the Black Sea in Turkey. Yes, there are plains and fields there, but the river that is now identified as the Thermodon is only 40 kilometers long. The plain surrounded by mountains and the sea is about 50 kilometers long and about 30 kilometers wide. In my opinion, this is too small an area for the formation of an exclusively cavalry army. And in order to come to the aid of the Trojans, these brave girls would have had to cross almost 900 kilometers through the mountains. And that's if you go in a straight line, but if you follow the coast, it's as much as 1,500, so it's quite something. Some ancient authors believe that the homeland of the Amazons was Libya. For some reason, they suddenly began to migrate and, with a huge cavalry army, traveled from Libya through Egypt to the north, then through Syria, all the way to the southern borders of modern Turkey, and, having reached the mountains there, founded several cities. This is exactly on the opposite side from their previous likely location. And from there, you also have to make your way through the mountains for more than 500 kilometers to reach Troy. How passable this route is can be learned from the story of Alexander Makedonsky, who also wandered with his army in those places. And for his infantry army to pass, in one of those places, he had to call for a miracle and move the sea away from the shore, just like Moise. But after the Trojan War, all ancient historians sigh with relief and calmly settle the Amazons where they are supposed to be, on the plains of the Azov region with Voronezh, on the northern border of the lands of Rumelia, by the Western and Caspian Seas on the eastern side, and of course, in the Azov region, they formed a close connection with the Scythians. It's interesting how this migration is described in the myths. Supposedly, after losing the final battle, the Greeks put the captured Amazons on 3 galleys and sent them as slaves to Greece. But at night, the Amazons killed the small guard and sailed off wherever their eyes could see. But how did they sail? They didn't know how to steer the galleys, so after many days, some current brought them to
the shores of the My Ocean.
The lake, that is, to the shores of the Sea of Azov, right to Taganrog or maybe Mariupol. But here's the question. How could 3 galleys with captives, girls who don't know how to handle them? After many days of sailing, they didn't lose each other and kept going in the same direction. And most importantly, how did they slip through the Kerch Strait without noticing the shores? One more nuance, Aeschylus places the homeland, but the Amazons immediately go there, to the area near the Sea of Azov. One might think that he is actually writing about the time when the Wonder Girls had already escaped from Greek captivity. But the thing is that Aeschylus writes about this in the poem Prometheus Bound, the events of which took place before the Trojan War. In addition, Plutarch mentions that once, during one of their wars, the Amazons landed in Crimea after crossing the Kerch Strait. And this means that the Amazons originally lived in the Azov region, but specifically for the events of the Trojan War, they moved to Turkey. They lived there for 150 years, and then accidentally returned to their homeland on unmanned galleys. Moreover, archaeology also adds fuel to the fire. On the territories of the Azov region, Ukraine, Kuban, all the way to Voronezh, and even in Kazakhstan, mass burials of women warriors are found, but in Turkey it's a different story. To be precise, not a single burial of Amazons has been found there yet. But historians are not giving up, and gathering their willpower, they have decided that these are not the graves of Amazons, but rather women from nomadic peoples who fought alongside men. That's some questionable logic. So, it turns out that we are witnessing a remarkable coincidence of circumstances which led to an entire people being moved from their native lands to places unsuitable for their usual way of life. And about 150 years later, in just as remarkable a way, they returned back. Either way, we are facing one of the large-scale falsifications of history, with massive substitution and rewriting of original sources. And, as with any falsification, it's simply impossible to change everything. Somewhere something is bound to come out. And yes, by the way, ancient historians also report that after the Trojan events, supposedly, upon returning to their homeland in the Azov region, the Amazons suddenly realized that life without men was somehow inconvenient for them, and they urgently began to assimilate with the Scythians. Subconsciously, there is an obvious catch in all of this. But who could have had enough desire, persistence, strength, and power to rewrite the necessary sources like that, to persuade the key historians? Schliemann could have as an option. A couple of million in the mid-19th century is an enormous amount of money. Well, let's get back to the Trojan War. The most important figure in this whole story is not the Trojan kings, not the armies of Ethiopians, Amazons, or Greeks, not Achilles and not Hector, but the Dardanian prince Aeneas. He played a key role in our modern history. After fleeing from the destroyed Troy, it was he who laid the foundations of the Roman Empire. But more on that later, since his very participation in the Trojan War and his escape are full of inconsistencies. Aeneas himself, Aeneas was a relative of the Trojan king, directly through the male line. Here's how it happened. There was a certain mythical character named Dardan, who was the ancestor of the Dardanian tribe. One of his descendants was Erichthonius, a king who owned herds of horses. Erichthonius had a son named Tros, and Tros had three sons, Ilus, Assarach, and Ganymede. So Ilus founded the city of Ilion, which is considered Troy, and Aeneas was the great-grandson of his brother Assarach. And here it suddenly turns out that Troy was not the name of a city, but of an entire territory, a country, so to speak. And it was not ruled by a single king, but by three descendants of those three brothers. And it is located in the area that is now called Troad. In Russian, this sounds very similar to triada, which means triumvirate in Latin. That is, perhaps the myth about Dardan and his descendant Tros is simply a myth for Western people. It turns out that Troy is literally an entire confederation of three countries ruled by three relatives. That's why it's called Troy. But we got distracted. So, Aeneas was the prince of one of these three kingdoms, the Dardanians, and accordingly a co-ruler. The kingdom of the Dardanians was located right next to the kingdom of Ilion, and that means he simply had to come to the aid of besieged Ilion, Troy. And he did, but only in the 10th year of the siege. What was he waiting for so long? He thought that the Trojans could win without him. One can speculate for a long time, but perhaps the answer here is simpler and more banal. Do you remember the legend of the 300 Spartans defending Sparta from the countless Persian hordes at the Thermopylae Pass? If you know the story from movies, then most likely you think there were actually only 300 of them. If you know the story from school, then you remember that besides them, there was also 100 volunteers. And in both cases, everyone knows that Athens didn't come to help. But in reality, there were up to 5,000 volunteers from neighboring settlements and cities, and Athens really didn't come by land. But they sent a huge fleet for those times and lined up a row of ships from the shore to the horizon. And that's exactly why the Persians couldn't outflank the Spartans from the sea. Perhaps in the Trojan War, the situation was similar. The Dardans all these years did not let the Greeks outflank Troy from the rear. But that's just my assumption. So, in the 10th year of the siege, Aeneas began to help the Trojans directly on the battlefield. In addition, the Trojans were joined by the Ethiopians under the leadership of King Memnon and the Amazons led by Penthesilea. One way or another, all these leaders were killed in battle personally by Achilles. He would have killed Aeneas too if Neptune had not cooled his ardor and saved our hero. But Troy was still impregnable, and time was running out, if not literally burning the ground beneath the feet of the gods. Troy had to be taken urgently, or they would have to leave empty-handed. Not just leave, but flee. There was a sense that something terrible was approaching. Perhaps it was this circumstance that prompted Odysseus to come up with a deceptive trick with the horse. Debates about this deception have not subsided for centuries. But personally, I like the theory that the horse actually refers to some kind of divine means of transportation, which is subtly hinted at by ancient historians, in particular Vergilius in the poem Aeneid. But that's a separate topic for a video, and in my opinion, it's covered in great detail on the YouTube channel Troyanettes, in his video, The Trojan Horse. I completely agree with his analysis, so in order not to make the film longer, I'll just provide a link to his video. And only when Troy was captured, Aeneas, along with a number of people, managed to escape. And after that, the most logical thing would probably have been to return to his kingdom in Dardania, which was located right here, nearby, very close. But for some unknown reason, Aeneas decides to take what seems to be a completely illogical action. He does, of course, return to Dardania, but for some reason he can't settle there. It's as if the gods are whispering to him, "Leave, go as far as you can, run away from here. You can't live here now." And he builds ships, boards them, and sails away. These events are described in detail by Vergilius in his Aeneid. And here you need to read how exactly he describes it. Here are these lines in the banners of the gods. "More than once we began to build ships. Near Antandros in the forests at the foot of Phrygian Ida, we began gathering people, though we did not know where fate would take us or where we would be allowed to settle. Spring has come. Anchises ordered us to trust our fate to the sails, my father. The harbor and my native shore, in the fields where Troy once stood, I leave in tears and set out into the open sea. Exile Virgil Aeneid, book 3rd line from the 1st to the 10th. Once again, the fields where Troy once stood. But let's compare it to reality. The fields around Troy in Turkey really do exist. There's no arguing with that. In reality, it's also just a small flat strip about 25 by 13 kilometers in size. That is literally a tiny patch of land where a cavalry army couldn't even form up. But there really are fields surrounded by hills, almost mountains, and about 60 kilometers away in a straight line is that very same Mount Ida of Phrygia. It seems true, but look, 60 kilometers really isn't that far. It's quite possible to cover that distance on horseback at a gallop in an hour or an hour and a half. And the Dardanians didn't just run there from the formation, they hid there for a long time while they built ships for their further escape. Did the Greeks really not care about them? Maybe so. Or maybe, in fact, the Dardanians went much farther than historians believe. Or maybe the Greeks were also in a hurry to leave those places, and they didn't care about the refugees. Or maybe it was both at the same time. But let's compare the area with the Azov region. There are fields here too, and in fact, there are many more than in Turkey, thousands of times more. But what is confusing is the place at the foot of Mount Ida Phrygian, where in the Azov region there are mountains. In fact, there are none. But at this moment, Aeneas had already moved far away from Troy, all the way to the opposite borders of his own kingdom. And if we draw the same analogy, but from Taganrog, we can encounter the Caucasus Mountains on one side and the Crimean Mountains on the other. And what about the line, "Spring has already come"? This speaks about two nuances. First, the journey was not a short one, and second, the change of seasons. It's very noticeable. Spring has come. Turkey also experiences seasonal changes. But even in winter, the nighttime temperature there doesn't drop below +10 degrees, so you can easily keep running or swimming further. But if the temperature drops so much that the water freezes, then whether you want to or not, you'll have to stay for the winter. It's a stretch, I agree, it doesn't look that convincing. But let's keep reading Vergilius. Being at a loss as to what to do, Aeneas begins to pray to his ancestors. And straight from the depths of the hill, a voice reaches him. "Aeneas, flee from this land. And not just flee, but he is given a clear direction. Flee to the land of Italy, to the homeland of your ancestors, to the generous bosom of Dardanus. The steadfast grandchildren will welcome those who return. You will find your ancient mother, and the descendants of Aeneas will rule over that entire land." No sooner said than done. They boarded the ships and set sail, meaning they sailed exactly to the place indicated by the gods, to Italy. So, we know the route. Some time passes, and then comes the cherry on top. The winds opened the way for us, and Avstar called us into the open spaces. We put the ships back on the water, and the Trojans gathered again. Leaving the harbor, we set sail. The settlements and the shore recede. There is an island in the middle of the sea, revered everywhere as sacred. The mother of the Nereids and Aegean Neptune loved it, and this island is still known to this day, and we know its exact location. In any case, historians know, and I don't see any point in arguing with them right now. This is Snake Island in the Black Sea, the very island where the soul of Achilles was taken by his mother, the nymph Thetis. It's the same island, by the way, over which real battles are currently taking place. And here you can ask historians a direct question. How could the Trojans have ended up on this island? After all, if we go by the generally accepted location of Mount Ida in Phrygia, they would first have to pass the island of Lesbos, then somehow miss the Dardanelles Strait, and then sleep through the narrow Bosphorus Strait. At the same time, they would have to sail past the recently conquered Troy, and only then make their way roughly to Odessa, where just before reaching it, this island would appear. And then apparently they'll have to turn around because Italy is located in a completely different direction. But if they were sailing from Crimea along the coast as galleys are supposed to, then Snake Island would have been exactly on their way to Italy. And by the way, right across from there is Avster, who called them on their journey, or rather the future Austro-Hungary. Maybe it's just a joke? And literally the very next line of Vergilius confirms this directly. They sailed along the shores for a long time. After this, on their way, they come across the island of Crete. And that's correct, because on the route from Crimea to Italy, after the island of Zmini, sailing along the shores, you first enter the Dardanelles Strait, and then, passing many small islands, you literally run into the huge island of Crete. And again, something strange. According to Vergilius, the huge island of Crete at this moment is deserted and abandoned. It seems like there's a whole island the size of a kingdom, but then Apollon appears and forbids them from staying there. And they sail further. And in the end, the sun completed its circle in the meantime, and the year came to an end, and the icy winter raised the waves with hurricanes. Vergilius, Aeneid, Book 3, line 285. The location in this case can be determined precisely. Our travelers are currently in the Ionian Sea, not far from the Greek Cape Actium, opposite Italy. In January, the temperature on the southern coast can really drop to around 5 degrees Celsius at night, but during the day it's still about 12 to 15 degrees above zero. And even at night in January, the water doesn't drop below 13 degrees Celsius. Yes, that's cold water, but it's not icy. The wind speed in those places, even in January, averages 3 meters per second. Yes, hurricanes and storms do happen, but they're not constant, and no ice forms in the Mediterranean Sea. And Vergilius, in these lines, is not even writing about icy water, but specifically about an icy winter. That is, along with hurricanes and wind, winter came with snow and ice. Considering the fact that ancient historians almost never write about snow and ice in winter, this is more than surprising. Where did the ice near the shores of Greece come from? It gives the impression that at that moment, some kind of climatic anomalies began to occur on Earth. And mysterious people. When popularizers or filmmakers tell us about the Trojan War, particularly about the Trojans, that's usually what they call them. And that seems natural. After all, how else would you call those who live in the city of Troy? Everything is correct. In Moscow, there are Muscovites, in Paris, Parisians, in Greece, Greeks, in England, Englishmen, and so on. Of course, in Troy, there must be Trojans. Who else? But when you start reading ancient authors on your own, for example, Vergilius or Aeschylus, and even Strabo, you are surprised to discover that. Although the authors of the epics do call them both Trojans and descendants of Dardanus, as well as by some other epithets, this actually happens quite rarely. In the overwhelming majority of cases, ancient authors refer to them as some mysterious Teucrians. After fleeing from Troy, Aeneas almost continuously addressed his fellow countrymen as Teucrians. But why, and what does this name mean? Let's figure it out. As we have already found out, the inhabitants of a city are usually called by the name of the city in which they live. So Teucri are definitely not Trojans. More precisely, the Trojans themselves are only a small part of the people called Teucrami, So Teucri is actually the name of the people. But for that case, historians have other epithets, for example, Dardans, that is, the descendants of Dardan. But even here in the end, logic limits the name to the members of a single clan, the descendants of one person. So, the concept of Teucrians is even broader. Who are they then? And no one knows. So it turns out that the people inhabiting Troy are the only thing historians can say for sure about the Teucrians. Next, modern historians begin to draw parallels with another mysterious word, tzhkr, found in completely different epics. And through it begins the connection to Egyptian mythology and further fantasies, specifically fantasies. Since the connection between tzhkr and tevkram is completely made up, although if you use the methods of historians, you can create a much more interesting connection. Look, we know that tevkram is an entire people inhabiting the whole territory controlled by Troy, and therefore also the neighboring kingdoms, one of which was ruled, in fact, by Aeneas. And we also know that next to this kingdom were the lands of the Amazons, which, as we've already understood, were most likely originally in the steppes from Romania to the Caucasus, including the area near the Sea of Azov. We also found out that, after escaping from Troy, Aeneas went to the territory of his own kingdom, where he stopped at the foot of the mountains and began to build a fleet for his further escape to Italy. And after sailing away from his native shores, a day or two later, he came across Snake Island in the Black Sea. According to my version, Aeneas' kingdom was located on the Crimean Peninsula, and so far everything matched up. So it was necessary to find out whether there was a people on this peninsula with a name at least similar to Teucri. And though it's a miracle, there is one. According to the name of the peninsula in antiquity, Taurida, it was inhabited by the Tauri or Taurids, or, as one of the variants, the Teucri. For example, Stefan Wizantiski writes about it this way. Taurisa is a large and very remarkable island inhabited by many peoples. They say that Osiris, who yoked the bulls, plowed the land there, and from this very pair of bulls the people got their name. Here you have the connection with Egypt and an explanation for the name of the Teucroi. Moreover, there are so-called pre-Greek inscriptions in Cyprus of unknown origin, which are believed to belong specifically to the Teucroi. According to the conclusions made as early as 1950 by Tom B., according to Johnson, this language is extremely close to the Etruscan language. And in turn, Aeneas fled from Troy by the will of the gods to the land of his ancient ancestors, to Italy, to a specific place, to where the Vatican Hill stands on the Tiber River, to where the Etruscans still lived. Odyssey. And now let's spend a couple of minutes on the other participants of the Trojan War. What happened to the army of the victors? The Odyssey tells us about this. After the Greeks finished looting Troy and celebrating their victory, they, of course, gathered their entire fleet to set out on the return journey just as they had arrived. But on their way home, in the middle of the sea, they were struck by a hurricane of unprecedented force that destroyed almost the entire fleet. Almost all the victorious Greeks were wiped off the face of the earth in an instant. Only a chosen few survived, and among them was Odysseus. So, the storm carried his ships far to the south of Troy. This is written about directly. And the first adventure tells us that he ended up in a land where the lotus grows. Let's look at the map. To the south of Turkey are Africa and Egypt. Where is the lotus there? Maybe only in the Nile Delta, but there are plenty of people there, and Homer only mentions a wild tribe of lotus eaters. But if Troy was located in the Sea of Azov, then far to the south it's the northern coast of Turkey. There are plenty of lakes there where the lotus grows. The next adventure, right after this one, is with the Cyclopes who lived in the valley of Mesgor. Pay attention, Homer doesn't say a word about it being any kind of island. He clearly says, We soon arrived in the land of the Cyclopes, who do not know justice. They dwell between the mountains in deep caves. Homer Odyssey, Book 9, lines 105 to 110. And again, if Odysseus were on the shores of Egypt, there are no mountains or valleys along the coast, but the northern coast of Turkey is simply abundant with them, as well as with caves. By the way, after leaving the shore of the Cyclopes, Odysseus comes across the floating island of Aeolus. Its location is still unclear. However, if you carefully read its description, the floating island was surrounded by an impenetrable bronze wall, and its shores consisted of steep cliffs. Doesn't it remind you of anything? A huge island capable of floating, surrounded by vertical bronze walls. Yes, this is simply a description of a modern ship, something like an oil tanker or a cruise liner for 5,000 passengers with swimming pools and greenhouses. And how else could Odysseus describe a huge metallic structure in the middle of the sea, moving on its own without oars or sails? And on this island, he is given a certain device with winds which carries him home. 9 days and nights. Aeolus' motor keeps running continuously, but in the end, something breaks or a new hurricane rises. It's not clear, but they are blown exactly back. The second time, Aeol and his device no longer recharge them, and Odysseus has to sail on his own again. And when he enters another bay, a hail of solid rocks falls upon his ships. The legend says that it was supposedly giants who threw them, but maybe it was just the fallout of fragments from a huge meteorite or asteroid that broke up in Earth's orbit. Who knows? Next was the island of Ioitia, ruled by the sorceress goddess Circea. Now it's nowhere to be found either. Apparently it was also floating. In any case, for some reason, no one knew the way back to native Ithaca from there. Not even the sorceress herself. Or maybe they're not telling us something? Judge for yourself. When the sorceress turned Odysseus's companions into pigs, Hermes gave Odysseus a potion that protected him from magical transformation. And after the sorceress's potion didn't work, she became afraid of Odysseus and immediately offered to sleep with him. Hermes foresaw such a turn of events and strictly forbade Odysseus from refusing this gift. Thus, his companions were freed from the spell, and after that, they all stayed to live with the sorceress for a whole year. All this time, they spent their days eating and drinking to their heart's content, and Odysseus himself also slept with the goddess. As a result, they did not leave the island for a whole year, and then suddenly found themselves who knows where. Naturally, it suggests the conclusion that the island was just as floating as the previous one, Aeolus. By the way, their name is very similar to modern abbreviations like End of Life and EEI. Where they had drifted during that time and how to get home from there, no one knew. Therefore, the goddess advised them to go through the kingdom of the dead, descend into Hades, and ask one of the dead spirits for directions. To reach the river Styx, they sailed with the wind and once again found themselves where they had started. In any case, Homer writes it this way: we finally crossed the deep ocean. Current, there is the land and city of the Cimmerian men. Everlasting Homer. Odyssey, Book 11, line 10. And Cimmeria, as we know, is again Crimea plus Transcaucasia, between the Sea of Azov and the Caspian. That is, in other words, all this time Odysseus was wandering around the Black Sea, but one way or another, Odysseus and his companions reached the kingdom of the dead. There they questioned whoever they needed, and it turned out that they went there not exactly to find out the way, but to discover what misfortune had befallen them. Why can't they return home? They found out, took the information into account, and sailed home. On the way, they also visited the Sirens. Then the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, which many researchers associate with the strait between Italy and Sicily. But it seems to me that this is more like the Dardanelles or the Bosphorus, which connects the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. Then they accidentally offended the sun god, and once again a storm scattered all the remaining crew in the ship. Only Odysseus survived, and on a piece of driftwood, he was saved by the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him. She hid him somewhere deep in her cave and enjoyed his company for another 7 years. Then, with the help of Athena, Odysseus finally managed to break free, and he began his journey home. But he didn't have a ship, so he had to build a raft with a sail all by himself. Let's be honest, it's not the fastest means of transportation, but at least it can float. For 17 days, Odysseus tried to drift along on his raft under sail, apparently following the coastline, and on the 18th day, a storm of unprecedented strength struck him again. The raft is destroyed, and Odysseus himself swims to the nearest shore and ends up among some people called the Phaeacians. They welcome him warmly, and after some time, they give him a ship, which takes him back to his homeland. An interesting point is that, first of all, the Phaeacians themselves are clearly not ordinary people. Their city is also made of metal resembling copper. Their ships also sail on their own, controlled by the power of thought. And secondly, when they give Odysseus one of these ships, they put Odysseus himself into a kind of sleep, anabiosis, during which the ship automatically delivers him to his homeland. Many at this point will think that this is an analogy with some kind of space.
Ship, but
Personally, I think that Odysseus was put to sleep just so he wouldn't mess anything up. And now let's put all the events together. First of all, both Aeneas and Odysseus spent a long time getting back to their homeland. In fact, for a significant part of that time, 7 years, they both spend in underground shelters. At the end of the Trojan War, a major cataclysm begins on the territory of at least Europe and Asia, causing continuous storms and hurricanes. In the Black Sea, huge stones are observed falling, and in the Mediterranean, a fierce, cold, and snowy winter begins. Not only Greeks and Trojans perish, the rest of the planet's population also dies out en masse. The shores where our heroes dock, on their way back, turn out to be deserted and uninhabited. Everywhere there is climatic chaos. The only living beings left are various kinds of crazed giants, cyclops, and some very strange tribes like the Phaeacians, who in turn strongly resemble representatives of other civilizations. They are the only ones who continue to observe the impending catastrophe from the surface, staying on iron, automatic floating islands. But after the active phase of the catastrophe ends, they disappear as well. The Trojan War put a final end to the underground existence of the ancient gods and goddesses, who surely knew about the coming catastrophe and were preparing zones of influence for their representatives among humans. An era of harsh pragmatic reality was beginning, where gods were merely fictional characters, where only fanatics believed in the afterlife, and where the supreme deity was considered to be human reason alone, which is not always the case. And to invest his whole life and suddenly acquired wealth in rewriting history as if the events had taken place somewhere entirely different.
I know you fight for God and you believe it's right to risk your home, your life to face the evil night. But in the darkest night, when our children are asleep, I think about the families of our enemy. Feel the same, believe in their own truth. They must love their children as fiercely as we do. We all share one thing, our heart hearts were given from above, and the only thing worth fighting for in this world is love. See the truth. Music is playing. And you believe it right. To risk your home, your life, to face the evil night. But in the darkest night, when our children are asleep, I think about the families of our enemies.